I wish I grew up with Hollow Knight, because Hollow Knight, I'm calling it here and now, will go down as one of the most influential video games ever. And if it hasn't already, it will cement its place in history in the very near future. And I've got proof, I've got receipts, I've got data to show this game isn't here to just mess around as an indie darling. It's the real deal. So let's go through some of the key aspects that make this game built diff from some of the indies or even the AAA contemporaries. In terms of gameplay, this game is a masterclass for anyone that plays it. And if you've played it, especially that first playthrough, you already know what I'm talking about. And the most amazing thing is that it's one of the most comprehensible quote-unquote masterclasses, in the sense that the mechanics that encompass this game are so carefully and expertly stripped down to its core to avoid bloat. And it's not basic, but it's not convoluted neither. It hits that fine line that only masters of their craft can. For example, let's take a look at character progressions. It's pretty simple. You get to upgrade your weapons, abilities, and there isn't much thought that is required of you as a player because there's very little downside to it. And if it was just that sounds kind of bad, but obviously with this game, they add intrigue and complexity to this seemingly mindless mechanic by presenting you with choices and consequences with the order of how you progress and upgrade the knight. It's not a question of if, but rather how. It's just that simplest of twist and that the angle at which it approaches the mechanics. Because when you're actually playing the game, you don't notice the individual parts, but it feels more like a symphony. Every little bit is wonderfully interwoven with and around each other, the way they play off of each other, because that character progression and upgrading is tied into finding rewards and resources out in the world, which is so beautifully designed with traversal and secrets in mind. And also it happens to have one of the coolest map mechanics in all of video games, which is tied to the charm system, which is the game's form of character expression and buildcraft, and on it goes. And we haven't even gotten to the star of the show, which is the movement and combat, because it's just so snappy. The knight jumps exactly how high you want it to. The moment you let go of that jump button, he immediately starts to fall down. I'm not even sure there's much of an acceleration or deceleration around the start and peaks of the jumps. And so the knight just feels so light and allows for a lot of adjustments midair to navigate fights or traverse the world. It's unrealistic for sure, but it feels incredibly tight and intuitive almost, and ultimately it gives you that satisfying sense of control over the character, which is a good thing. And as good as the movement feels, the absolute best part of Hollow Knight's mechanics is the downward slash. Specifically the downward slash to pogo bounce off enemies and objects. In this game, when you're midair, whether you're falling or after you've jumped, you can slash downward to do this sick sweeping attack. And you know, that's cool in and of itself, but if you hit an enemy or an object, it will stop you from falling and slightly push you upward, like you're pogo bouncing off of the enemy, allowing you to essentially do another downward slash, and you can chain this over and over and over again. And just as an aside, in writing this script, I realized how often pogoing pops up in video games. Hollow Knight, Shovel Knight, Yoshimitsu from Tekken even maybe? Or I mean definitely Mario jumping off of one Goomba to another is essentially a pogo move. And so there's like a history of video game characters pogoing. And at this point, maybe it's just one of those video game things that feel good and seems right, even though it doesn't really make sense, like dodge rolls, double jumps, parries. And if they had left it at that, it would have been perfectly serviceable, but with Hollow Knight, as it tends to be the theme with this game, they didn't go the safe, bare minimum route. They spiced up an existing mechanic in the simplest way by adding a slash command to prompt the bounce. Because if you don't actively slash down, you're just gonna fall into an enemy, get hit, and probably lose your footing. But if you time it right, it'll damage your foe and reset your double jump for you. That added layer of having to time the slash to pogo properly, that's that genius level adjustment that makes this move so much more satisfying. Because all of a sudden it's high stakes poker. If you mess up, you're gonna get hit, you'll lose progress most likely, but if you get it right, and it's just, you know, damage, reset, and you just feel so in control and so like a master of the needle and the character and the movement. And the best part is that it just makes you look forward to just moving around in the world. And in a Metroidvania game, you're gonna make me look forward to moving around, like looking for cool pogo opportunities with all that backtracking that naturally comes with the genre. Good stuff. As always with any of my projects, I start with a sphere and sketch out the rough shapes and proportions. I try to move loosely and quickly to avoid getting into a funk early on. Essentially, as I'm sketching, I'm trying to figure out some of the answers to the big questions early on, like what am I gonna sculpt, what's the story, the pose, composition, scope, purpose, why even do any of this? And for me, one of the best ways to set these project parameters is to research the source material, or whatever the thing that inspired the project to begin with. And in thinking about Hollow Knight, the concept essentially became Hollow Knight has great nail swinging mechanics and it's tied with one of the tightest movements in gaming, but on the other hand the character designs are so clean and simple. So the idea of showcasing that juxtaposition, simple and clean characters that seemingly appear docile, performing and stretching themselves into these intricate, complex, almost contorting themselves to attack and dodge and navigate everything in a small window of opportunity. Because that's how it feels like sometimes playing the game. You've got to dodge a little bug crawling on the floor while pogoing off of a chunky boy and not get hit by a bee spewing yellow goo across the screen. So regardless of which characters were involved in the diorama, I knew the composition needed characters weaving in and around each other like in some martial arts movie. And obviously, the knight is going to have a prominent role in the diorama. It's the main character, is on the cover art, and after all that pogo business, I can't think of a more fitting pose than the downward slash midair. So the real question is, what's the knight going to be downward slashing? It got me going through the amazing cast of creatures and enemies that call Hollow Nest home. Just looking at some of these crawlers and flyers, they have nice variety in terms of sharpness and roundness. Just look at how distinct and interesting their silhouettes are, variety in their movement and their gameplay function. The overall great creature design. Some of the more particularly memorable ones are like the Mantis Lords, the crazy corrupted version of the Knight, some of the big chunky bosses early on. I like the two-handed mace guy, and then later there's a red-robed wizard one, and of course, Hornet. And speaking of Hornet, I gotta come clean about something because from a distance, even before having ever played Hollow Knight, I knew that the fans of this game were super hyped for Silksong. And I've seen promotional materials, concept art for Silksong prior to ever having played the game. And I think a lot of people share that experience finding Hollow Knight years later. You come into the game knowing about the presence of Silksong and the iconographies. So when I first saw Hornet appear in this fancy, glossy, mossy area, I immediately recognized the character. I didn't know what she was gonna do, and I definitely didn't know that she'd have one of the more satisfying character arcs in this game, akin to Metroid from Super Metroid. Going from fighting us to, spoilers, eventually helping us fight the final boss at the end. Enemies to allies trope, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's a classic arc. And it's a good one. I really like how it works in this game. It works well. So yeah, Hornet's gonna make the cut for the diorama, as if there were any doubt. But we can't talk about Hornet without bringing up the Hollow Knight, because they're an integral part of each other's stories, which, by the way, it stands on its own as a great final boss fight. Needle versus needle combat, close combat, no shenanigans, very little gimmicks. It feels very conclusive to everything that the game has been teaching you and training you. It feels very fair, and yeah, it's just a fantastic fight. And on top of all of that, there's a narrative finality to it when Hornet comes in to help us with the final boss fight. So, it's a great conclusion and it rules. The only thing is I just wish we got to fight alongside Hornet instead of essentially getting a cutscene where Hornet is pinning down the Hollow Knight. And obviously I'm not alone in this because everyone wants to play as Hornet. Just look at the main character for the sequel, and for now I'll have to settle with sculpting the diorama. Knight, Hornet, interwoven in an intense battle with the Hollow Knight. And not to get too sidetracked here, but while we're talking about the ending, I haven't played many Souls-like games. Dark Souls 1, Blasphemous 1 and 2, Elden Ring, Hollow Knight. And really, Blasphemous 1 and 2 are, along with Hollow Knight, are more of a Metroidvania first. It's this new brand of Metroidvania Souls-like hybrid, which I dare say Hollow Knight had a huge part in showing the world how to fuse these two subgenres together. But I guess I'm just unclear if this is just a trope at this point or a coincidence, but I found it interesting that the general setup and premise of this endless cycle of characters trying to reach the boss, final boss rather, and replacing it, Hollows, Knights, Penitents, trying to reach their respective Lord of Cinders, Radiance, Miracle. It seems to be almost shamelessly repeated in these games. And I understand that it's a great narrative structure to justify the gameplay loop and direction, but still, I think about what defines a Souls-like as a genre, it's things like brutal but honest boss fights, bonfire mechanics, losing progression currency when you die, having a story or lore not explicitly told to you, or even told through a biased lens, and untrustworthy NPCs. But I didn't think that the literal actual story of Dark Souls 1 was part of what makes this subgenre what it is, because I really hope it isn't. I love playing Dark Souls, and I'd love to try playing a Souls-like that has a different story than the ones presented in Hollow Knight or Dark Souls, Elden Ring even. And admittedly, I haven't played that many in the genre, and I will continue to do so, maybe it'll all be for nothing at the end, but I just found it interesting that there are so many similarities in the narrative structure of the only 4 to 5 Souls-like I've ever played. And I can't be the only one that just happens to pick these games to play, and they all have very similar stories. I love the genre, but I just hope it has depth, not just with combat and builds, but with plot and story and characters as well. So now we got the Knight, Hornet, and the Hollow Knight. And with these 3 particular characters, I just wanted to try and capture the close combat nature of a needle versus needle fight. Really just putting myself in the mindset of what that world would be like. What would a needle combat really feel like? Because the game is already full of amazing animations for the Knight and all the enemies and creatures. But even then, it's still a game, and games, rightfully so, have limitations. Like the enemy moves are more or less going to be consistent and readable, at least if it's a good game. A Mantis's lunge is always going to have the same wind-up, distance covered, timing, so that it becomes predictable, and as a player, it's more satisfying to learn these things and sort of a trait of Souls-like games. So with this diorama, I wanted to have these characters move in ways that I haven't necessarily seen in the game while maintaining the essence of the character. When you look at the pose, you can think, oh yeah, I could believe that this character would be in that pose or would do that kind of movement, even though we haven't really seen it in the game. Essentially what I'm saying, like what I really want is poses that we'd see in a Hollow Knight anime. And in that vein, I think the character I got closest to accomplishing that is with the Hollow Knight. The Knight and the Hornet, they're doing their standard downward slash, dashing across the screen. We've seen it in the game, we've even played it for the downward slash at least, and yeah, I guess I played it a bit safe there, but with the Hollow Knight, I managed to get him in this nice corkscrewing, almost impossible, uncomfortable looking pose. Just doing what he needs to survive and fend off these 2 type of mentality in that pose, and I think it really does a good job of embodying that. So, not to toot my own horn too hard, but I'm sort of proud of it. I'm pretty proud of it. And it has this nice chunky centerpiece for everything else to go around it. And so with that, more or less, I think the base structure of the diorama is done. So now we're off to finally coloring. And this happens every time with coloring. I mistakenly hoped that coloring this piece would be simple, because my thinking was that the overall design and palette of Hollow Knight is pretty simple, so why wouldn't it be easy to emulate that? And I already know I brought this up, but I just really want to emphasize just how clean the artwork is in this game. If you're an artist or even have a remote interest, you know that it's often more complicated to manage a good, simple design. You must have heard this from designers talking about how difficult it is to reduce as opposed to add. And from my experience, I find that to be true as well, because you place more restrictions on yourself by keeping things simple and down to a few fundamentals. You can easily mess up and do simple dull, but it takes an expert to do simple and interesting. And I think that carries over to the coloring as well. It's difficult to assign great, meaningful colors to, these characters, especially if you're working with a limited palette. And make sure the colors fit and isn't too loud, and especially with a limited color palette, it's difficult. And I think Hollow Knight does a fantastic job of only adding to the every element of Hollow Knight, the design, the color, they continue to add on to each other as opposed to taking anything away, and that's just a mastery at a next level. And yet, despite all of these praises I've been giving and can continue to give, nothing compares to how good the world design is in this game. Hollow Nest is so beautiful and inspiring. When I think about the game, sure, the gameplay is amazing, the character design top tier, even the price of the game for such a quality product is unbelievable. To think how such a small studio pulled this off, it's amazing top to bottom, front to center, yet the world design stands alone as easily, indisputably the best aspect of this game. I truly believe that in the future, the world of this game will stand alone as its triumph and contribution that it has given to the world. This game is just pure class. Take a screenshot and put them in any museum and they'll hold up to any other paintings. Maybe not Turner's, but pretty much any other paintings, right? In a contemporary museum because every screen is blasted with awe-inducing vibes. Colors, fauna, foliage variety. This game got me thinking about and appreciating foliage variety. NPC variety, not just how they look, but the way they interact with the world and the players. The events that take place in these zones. There's a freaking banker that just runs off with your deposit, and if you don't hunt her down, the money is probably just gone. Even the different layers in the foreground, background, all of these aspects combine so well to present the breadth of uniquely beautiful and creatively inspiring zones. Digging in further, the game does a wonderful job of combining these individually amazing zones together in a way that adds and alludes to a larger world of the narrative. There are so many games where you often see unrelated worlds and zones patched together. You know, Mario has a green world next to the desert world, next to the water world. Even in RPGs like Zelda or WoW, there's a snow zone that's all of a sudden next to the Mount Doom clone, next to the desert. In terms of the larger world, what's really connecting them all together, right? In Hollow Nest, it's like they took the bug zone and had 20 different ways to interpret the assignment. Mossy bugs, mushroom bugs, dark and creepy crawler bugs, rocks and mineral bugs, social bugs with their own sense of honor and all this. Really, the beauty of the world in some sense is the scope of it, how deep it goes in one particular theme, so to speak. And Hollow Nest has a level of variety and depth as any other open world RPGs or MMOs, despite everything being a bug zone. But it goes even further because everything feels more cohesive and tied together. Cohesive not because it's within the bounds of a game map, but cohesive because it's within the bounds of your mind. You know, if you've played this game, you have a mental picture and understanding of the world. And sure, you could attribute the understanding of the world to the map mechanic and everything, but in any other game without the incredible zones that this game has, I don't think it would stick as well as it does for Hollow Knight. Because you cannot traverse through an area like Green Path, Deep Nest, or City of Tears and not have your foundations shook a little bit. And what's astounding is that the game doesn't even say a lick about it. Like, they seemingly don't care if you sleep through this masterclass in world design that they're giving you. It's such a baller move to just risk all the beauty, just go by unseen. I can continue to sing the praises of Hollow Knight from so many more angles, but lastly, it's the fandom. It's most likely that even if you've never played the game, you are aware of Hollow Knight. The world, the characters, at the very least some of its iconographies. Hollow Knight has an amazing fandom, and I think it's because the game lends itself to being an excellent base game for fans to contribute to. There are just some games that attract fans more than others, and Hollow Nest, for a lack of a better phrase, draws fans in like a moth to a flame. We're talking in-depth lore videos, countless speedruns, inspiring fan art, and a full-blown Pale Court fan-made DLC. It's not the most important metric of fandom, but it can be. A fandom can tell a lot about how people are interacting and thinking about the game, about how they're digesting the game, how it's settling in their minds and their lives. If I was a kid during my most formidable years, it's this type of fandom that helps me fall in love with the game. Helps me learn about myself, where I fit in, not just within the fandom, but within the larger context of everything. Because I remember being a kid and having fun without a worry in the world, you know, and wanting to just contribute and just dive fully into a particular game or a particular series, franchise. And it's a bit sad to admit, but, you know, I remember those moments less and less as I'm getting older. But I don't think it's necessarily a time thing, because it's not like I'm remembering less of it or just forgetting it. It just feels distant. And it's accelerating away from me. And surprising to me too, because it's not like something I push away. Definitely not something I push away. If anything, I'm trying very hard to actively hold on to those memories and feelings. You know, you could call me a man-child all you want. I'll probably wear that every once in a while. But every once in a pale moon, there are these artworks like Hollow Knight that remind me of the old times and the heartwarming feeling of remembering those old times. Not necessarily as it was, but as it could have been or was in your mind. To feel complete and happy about the path that I've walked and continue to walk despite where it all began. Not to ignore consequences or whatever, but to rejoice, to embrace the happenstances, the circumstances. So really enjoy it and cherish it, because these absolute gems of an artwork that serve as an emotional and spiritual time capsule, but also a touchstone to look back upon, to reflect, to compare your current life to a moment in time in your past. They don't come around as often as one might need to navigate through this whole thing called life. And thank goodness for all these amazing artists that continue to push themselves and make amazing games, artworks, what have you, because it's a rare and beautiful thing. And every time it does pop up every once in a while, seemingly out of nowhere, allow yourself, open yourself, allow yourself to be influenced by it. Don't let it go by and miss out on what it could contribute to you, and in turn what you can contribute back to the community or the world at large. And